Have you ever been hurt so deeply that the only thing you could do was stay silent? No screaming, no retaliation, just quietly walking away. And if you've ever thought that was weakness, stay until the end of this video. Because the truth is, refusing to take revenge isn't a sign of fragility, but the highest expression of inner strength. In a world where retaliation is celebrated as justice, there are still those who choose a different path. Not to defeat anyone, but to avoid losing themselves. This video is not meant to attack or label anyone. It's meant to reveal what truly happens when someone who once loved with all their heart chooses healing over destruction. If you've ever felt alone in your journey through pain, if you've ever questioned whether your kindness made you vulnerable, then this is your story. Watch until the end of the video to understand why an empath, when they choose to walk away in peace instead of anger, creates the most powerful reversal in the dynamic with a manipulator. And if you see yourself in that journey, don't forget to hit subscribe and walk with us on the path of healing, awakening, and rebirth. Most people believe that when you're hurt, especially by someone cold, manipulative, and selfish, the natural response is anger, resistance, retaliation. It's one of the oldest reflexes in the human psyche. They hurt me, so I'll hurt them back. But there is a particular kind of person, the empath, who doesn't respond that way, not because they're too weak, but because they see what's truly happening more clearly than anyone else. They feel pain deeply, down to the cellular level. They recognize betrayal, humiliation, and manipulation, not only with logic, but with their entire body and heart. And yet, they don't allow that pain to define who they are. They choose not to retaliate. Not because they are naive, not because they are weak, but because they live with something the modern world is slowly forgetting, a living conscience. Not a rigid moral code written somewhere, but an inner voice, one that trembles, aches, and weeps at the thought of becoming what they once despised. And that very restraint, the refusal to become the dark version of themselves, is the highest expression of strength. Because mastering yourself when you have every reason to strike back is infinitely harder than giving in to rage. The real battle doesn't happen on the outside. It happens within, in the mind, the chest, in every silent decision no one else sees. They instinctively does not respond with revenge, but with self-reflection. When they are betrayed, they don't immediately assign blame. They turn inward. They ask, what did I do wrong? Not because they were wrong, but because they hold themselves to a higher moral standard than most ever dare to. That is not weakness. That is the courage of someone who wants to understand before they conclude. But that very thing often causes them to be misunderstood. To outsiders, they seem quiet, non-confrontational, still kind, and that is misinterpreted as acceptance. But the truth is, inside them, a war is taking place. One side is righteous anger, the other is compassion that refuses to let them become the one who caused harm. They don't want to become a reversed version of the one who hurt them. They don't want to become cold, harsh, or retaliatory, because in doing so, they would lose themselves. What makes an empath extraordinary is not that they don't feel pain, but that they embrace the pain without letting it transform them into someone else. They have enough strength to expose, to push back, to make the other feel the wound they once endured. But they choose not to, not out of fear, but because they understand the cost of entering the cycle of revenge, where everything is lost, even the soul. They don't choose to be a victim, but they also don't choose to be a warrior of revenge. They choose to become the awakened one. And that awakening often happens in silence. No audience, no applause, only a heart slowly returning to its rightful place. No longer dependent, no longer pleading to be seen, no longer trying to explain, to be understood. When an empath chooses not to retaliate, it doesn't mean they never imagined doing it. They have. They too wanted to expose, to shout the truth, to force the other to face the consequences. They have imagined a just ending where justice speaks and the manipulator finally pays the price. But then they realize something even more painful than betrayal. True justice doesn't come from the other person changing, but from refusing to let yourself be changed for the worse. Because an empath doesn't live merely for emotion. They live for internal alignment. They need to feel safe with themselves. They need to know that what they do, what they think, and what they feel are moving in the same direction. And revenge, no matter how deserved, pulls them off the axis of their own integrity. They understand this. An action taken in anger may bring instant satisfaction, but it leaves long-lasting residue in the soul. And for the empath, that is unacceptable. Because they are deeply familiar with the weight of feeling everything too much. They know the cost of imbalance is not only emotional, but spiritual. So they choose the harder path, forgiveness, not to justify, but to be free, not to let the other off the hook, but to stop carrying the psychological burden themselves. Forgiveness for the empath is not a gift for the other person, but a gift for themselves. They don't need an apology to begin healing. They just need a decision. One moment to say, I'm not walking this painful road any longer. And then they withdraw, not to escape, but to rebuild. Quietly, but powerfully. When the empath stops reacting, something remarkable happens. Power begins to shift. The narcissist, the one who is used to manipulating emotions, pulling psychological strings, controlling the reactions of others, is now faced with a silence they can't control. They send signals, no one responds. They provoke, no one reacts. They repeat old stories, but the listener is no longer the same person. That is the silent but fierce reversal of power. No arguments, no stage, just someone who has seen enough and decided not to perform anymore. Because the empath finally understands. Reaction is the fuel of manipulation. The more they get angry, explain, or try to prove something, the deeper they are pulled into the intricate system the narcissist carefully built. But when they choose inner stillness, when they disconnect emotionally, the narcissist is forced to face what they've always avoided, themselves. No one left to blame, no one left to emotionally trigger, no audience for their recurring emotional plays. And in that moment, the narcissist doesn't just lose a victim, they lose the mirror that once reflected their illusion of power. And the empath, they don't need to win, they just need to no longer belong to the play. Their silence isn't empty, it's full. It's a homecoming. It's placing a hand over their heart and saying, from now on, I am responsible for my emotions, no one else. And that is emotional sovereignty, a place no manipulation can reach. And from that moment of reclaiming inner control, something beautiful begins to form. Rebirth. No longer spinning in the vortex of manipulation, the empath begins returning to something they had forgotten for far too long, themselves. Day by day, little by little, they relearn how to live without needing to be accepted, without needing to be understood correctly. They no longer define themselves through the eyes of others, but through the light they kindle from within. That new life doesn't unfold loudly. It doesn't need to prove itself to the world, but internally, it is a revolution, a life where the empath no longer lives in defense. They no longer react, they respond with intention. They choose who enters their space. They choose what stays in their heart. They learn to draw boundaries, not through anger, but through clarity. And the miracle is this: when they stop seeking comfort from the outside world, those with a similar frequency begin to arrive, not because they tried to attract anyone, but because inner light has its own resonance, and those who have once broken but not been destroyed can recognize one another. On this new journey, the empath no longer lives to avoid pain, but to grow. They understand that pain is inevitable, but pain no longer rules them. It becomes a teacher, showing them how to love with wisdom, how to empathize with boundaries, and how to trust without betraying the truth within themselves. And when the empath stops living in avoidance and begins to actively learn from pain, pain starts to transform. Instead of closing them off, it opens them up. They no longer ask, why did this happen to me? But instead, what can I learn from this experience to live more deeply, more clearly, Pain is no longer a bleeding wound in the soul. It becomes building material for inner strength and emotional intelligence. They begin to see clearly what they once ignored, the red flags dismissed, the emotions suppressed just to keep the peace, the over-sacrificing rooted in the fear of abandonment. But instead of blaming themselves, they forgive. They forgive their past naivety. They forgive the part of themselves that once loved so unconditionally. And from that forgiveness, something stable begins to emerge. Self-worth, no longer tied to the past. That's why the empath after awakening becomes quietly different. They don't need sharp defenses. They just need to stand upright with clarity in their eyes. They don't need to shout, "I'm no longer a victim," because the calmness in their energy says it louder than any words could. Having experienced manipulation, they don't become bitter, they become discerning. They can see through fake apologies, emotional baiting, psychological push-pull tactics, but they don't expose anyone. They simply don't react. And in that stillness lies a new kind of power, the power of someone who is no longer controlled by fear or guilt. Because they know the truth doesn't need to be shouted to have value, it only needs to be lived. And from that quiet strength, the empath steps into a new phase, the phase of becoming a guide. No longer someone who needs saving, they become someone who inspires, not through theory, but through a presence refined by heartbreak, patience, and rebirth. They don't retell their pain, but those who've known pain can recognize them. They don't teach how to overcome, but being near them makes others feel safe because they don't judge. They don't rush. They listen as if they've stood exactly where you stand. And the truth is, they have. The empath, once healed, no longer tries to fix others at any cost. They understand everyone must walk on their own 2 feet, but they also know that when the light within is steady, it naturally spreads. No need to convince, no need to preach, just live truthfully, authentically, and fully. And so they walk gently without bitterness. Each step they take becomes a signpost for those who follow, that pain can be survived, that kindness is not an invitation to be used, and that silence, when it comes from awareness, has more power than any spoken word. They don't need a stage, they don't need proof, they only need to be themselves. And that is the most powerful testimony of healing and freedom. And then at some point, the empath no longer lives to avoid hurt, nor to prove they've survived. They begin to live simply because they deserve to. No longer driven by old wounds, no longer haunted by the question, why did that happen to me? Now they live with a new question. What can I do with the light that the darkness helped me see? They begin to build new relationships where no one has to save the other, where boundaries are not for defense, but for nurturing safety. They no longer need to be loved in order to feel worthy. They know they are already enough since the moment they chose to step out of the manipulator's orbit. And here's the beautiful part, when they stop trying to prove their worth, they start attracting relationships where there is no need for control or competition. They are no longer afraid of losing anyone because they no longer lose themselves just to make someone stay. From that place, they begin to live more deeply, love more wholly, and give more wisely. No longer sacrificing themselves unconditionally, but giving from a cup that is already full. And when you live from that fullness, no one can manipulate you anymore. This is not a victory to be boasted about. It is a quiet transformation, but one more powerful than any confrontation. Because the empath, after everything, does not choose to win the manipulator's game, they choose to stop playing. And that decision, not explosive, not bitter, not vengeful, is the most powerful awakening of all. Not directed at the other, but at the inner world they now live in, a world no longer driven by pain, but by awareness, wisdom, and self-respect. In the end, this is not a story about revenge. It's not about one person defeating another. This is the journey of a soul, once suffocated by empty promises, once convinced they had to sacrifice themselves to be loved, once believing that kindness alone could save everything, and then one day They woke up. The empath doesn't become strong because they made the manipulator suffer. They become strong because they chose not to hurt themselves ever again. They no longer need to play the savior or be the one who always understands or seek recognition to validate their worth. They only need one thing: to live in alignment with the truth inside themselves. And when they do that, they become untouchable, not because they've built walls, but because they have become their own foundation. No one can manipulate a person who no longer fears abandonment. No one can define a soul that has learned how to stand alone in the light after walking through darkness. And if you, the one watching this video, are also quietly walking that path, know that you are not alone. Every step you take, no matter how slow, no matter how uncertain, is bringing you closer to yourself. There is nothing wrong with having once believed. There is no weakness in having once loved. The only wrong is when you lose yourself trying to hold on to someone who was never truly present. But today you are different. You are beginning to see more clearly. You are healing. You are walking forward, not to escape, but to be reborn. And if this journey has stirred something within you, hit subscribe and join us as we continue walking the path of healing, awakening, and reclaiming true worth. Because the world needs more people like you, now more than ever. People who haven't just survived the darkness, but have become a light for others to find their way. And you, yes, you are one of those lights.